Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first in our series of virtual conference events. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Ryan Maddox of the CDC. Our other sessions, you can watch our website for updates in August, September, and October. So the conference is spread out over a number of months. We miss seeing you in DC this year, but we're glad you're able to join us for this session. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the program, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. So as you know, Dr. Maddox is an epidemiologist at the CDC. He is always very generous with his time, whether it's at our conference, answering family questions, or joining us for our teleconferences. So I'd like to just introduce Dr. Ryan Maddox of the CDC.
All right. Thank you, Debbie. And thanks, as always, to the CJD Foundation for letting me have this opportunity to talk. Sorry I can't be there in person this year. I always look forward to my trip to DC to meet with the families. But at least we have technology, and hopefully it's working for everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and follow along with the slides. I'll be talking a little bit tonight about what we do at CDC when we're not working on coronavirus stuff. So my day job is in the Prion and Public Health Office, and I'll be talking a little bit about what we do for CJD and other diseases. For those of you that don't know what CDC is, you probably haven't been following the news much, but we are under the Department of Health and Human Services, and we're the nation's leading public health agency. We attempt to keep America secure by controlling disease outbreaks. And again, you may have heard a little bit about that lately. Some good news, some bad news. Not all the reports have been glowing. What I can tell you is that a lot of people at CDC are working very hard, very long hours to try to get a handle on this whole COVID-19 thing. So that's part of our mission. We try to also make sure the food and water is safe, helping people avoid leading causes of death, working globally to reduce threats to the nation's health. Our headquarters are in Atlanta. We actually have facilities in 10 additional US locations and field staff in all the states and more than 50 countries. So CDC is a huge enterprise, more than 14,000 employees in nearly 170 different occupations. And it's the Centers for Disease Control. A lot of people think it's the Center for Disease Control, and that's because we're actually made up of a number of different centers. The center that I work in is the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases. And within that center, I'm in the Division of High Consequence Pathogens and Pathology. And our small little corner of that division is the Prion and Public Health Office. There's a small group of us there that work on surveillance for human prion diseases. And what that means is that we monitor a disease in the population. An example with prion disease, of course, would be we try to estimate prion disease rates. We try to detect changes in the epidemiology of the disease over time, monitor for the possible occurrence of variant CJD and other possibly new forms of prion disease. And finally, we try to gain knowledge about prion diseases in general. So how do we do this? How do we conduct surveillance of prion diseases? Well, the main way is that we match death certificate data with data from the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center. And the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center is based at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Usually during these talks each year in DC, you will have already heard a lot about the NPD-PSC by the time I talk. I assume a lot of you are already very familiar with their work, but basically they conduct state-of-the-art diagnostic testing for prion disease specimens from across the country. So they're a huge resource. CDC provides funding to them for them to provide these services. And in turn, we have access to their data for the various results of the specimens that they test. And so the national multiple cause of death data, on the other hand, is death certificate data. And we get that data from another CDC center, the National Center for Health Statistics. So death certificate data is a good resource for us. Why? Because unfortunately, everyone has this disease dies. 100% disease fatality rate, and the diagnosis is more accurate during the later stages of the disease. So death certificates, by and large, are accurate. We know that they're not always accurate, and I'll address that a little bit later. But we take the death certificate data, which is easily obtained and cost-effective, and we match it with the results of the specimen testing from the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center. What happens is we may have an autopsy positive specimen from the Prion Center that doesn't show up in the death certificate data. So we add that case to our statistics. On the other hand, we may have an autopsy negative case that is in the death certificate data, and we would remove that case as not being a true case of CJD or prion disease. So it goes both ways. And I will say that there are all sorts of things that end up on a death certificate besides CJD. It might say mad cow disease. It might say prion disease. It might say Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. It might say any number of various misspellings or genetic forms of the disease. We look for all those things through something called a literal text search. So even if it's not specifically coded as CJD, we'll still pick it up if it's written anywhere in any form on that death certificate. And a basic snapshot of what we've found by doing this. We've been matching this data since going back to 2003. 2018 is the most recent year of data that we have from the National Center for Health Statistics for those death certificates. So from 2003 to 2018, we had 6,781 people who were identified as having prion disease during that time period. And what that comes out to is an average annual age-adjusted incidence of 1.2 cases per million population. I know a lot of you have heard that statistic, 1 in a million. It's a 1 in a million disease. Close to it, 1.2 cases per million. Do we capture every single case? I'll go ahead and say it now, we do not. But I feel like we capture the vast majority of cases. But when we tell people what the true incidence is, we typically say, well, it's somewhere between 1 and 2 per million. You know, we can't nail it down exactly, but our own statistics, our own work has shown it to be right around 1.2. When you divide that by male and female, it's a little higher for males, 1.3, a little lower for females, 1.1 per million. And what we consistently find also is that this disease is much more common among whites compared to blacks, 1.3 per million for whites versus 0.6 per million for blacks. So there is a racial difference there that we don't truly completely understand what the reason is for that. This is also primarily a disease of the older population, as a lot of you know. Only 14 cases in that time period were less than 30 years of age. And what that comes out to is 7 cases per billion per year. So extremely rare for a case to be younger than 30. When that does happen, there's usually some sort of phenomenon or reason that we can blame that disease on, be it genetics or variant CJD or iatrogenic CJD. So out of those 14 cases, only 3 were sporadic. 1 was sporadic CJD and 2 were sporadic fatal insomnia. And like I said, the remaining 11, most of those were familial, including GSS and FFI. And we had 2 variant cases during that time period and 1 iatrogenic case that was related to Duramatter, which is a product that was used years ago, but has a very long incubation period potentially. And so people, can still come down with disease years later. Again, I said this was a disease of the older population. If you look at people 65 and older, that 1 per million jumps up to 6 cases per million. So it's more common, but still relatively rare. But another way of looking at this disease is that you have about 1 CJD death for approximately every 6,000 deaths overall in the US each year. So certainly that is a different way of looking at it that makes it sound a little more common. Some people are interested how many cases we add on to that death certificate data. From 2003 to 2018, it was between 6% and 18% a year. that we added based on positive autopsy results or genetic findings from the Prion Center. At the same time, we removed about 2% to 6% of cases based on negative autopsy at the Prion Center. A lot of you are familiar with a new test, a relatively new test at the MPD PSC known as the RT-QuIC test, which is an outstanding test. We don't manipulate the death certificate data yet based on the RT-QuIC. So if someone has a positive RT-QuIC but no autopsy, we want to add them onto the death certificate data if they're not already there. However, we are hoping that this test is going to lead to improvements in the death certificate data in the coming years. The doctors can use this as a resource when they're making diagnostic decisions so that hopefully they'll have that death certificate accurate at the time of the patient's death based on that positive RT-QuIC result. We do have RT-QuIC as part of our official case definition at CDC now. Basically, someone with a neuropsychiatric illness and a positive RT-QuIC would be considered to have probable CJD. We would only consider them to have definite CJD if we have that positive autopsy or biopsy brain tissue result. And I'm just going to look quickly at the last 2 years of data that we have, 2017 and 2018. During those years, we had 542 and 503 cases respectively. One of the most interesting aspects of this slide, I think, is the second bullet under each of those years. The first one saying 23 death certificate cases with RT-QuIC and no autopsy had a negative RT-QuIC. I said we don't change the death certificate data based on an RT-QuIC alone, but potentially some at least of those 23 cases aren't true cases. We don't have an autopsy to rule them out, but the negative RT-QuIC being such a good test, there's a good chance that 23 cases in 2017 or some portion of that are not true cases. And the same goes for 2018 when we had 21 such cases. You'll also see that during those years, we added 42 cases in 2017 and 32 cases in 2018 that were autopsy positive at the Prion Center and did not show up in the death certificate data. And there's various reasons for that, mostly because autopsy results don't come back until the death certificate has been completed. And so you don't have that evidence to make the diagnostic decision at the time the death certificate is completed. This is just another way of looking at the numbers from 2003 to 2018. You can see it's been relatively stable over the last half of this graph. You know, I think we have a pretty good handle on surveillance at this point, and that's why it's stabled out. There's a lot more awareness of the disease among, I'd say, health departments and practitioners, and better testing, to be honest. So, you know, not just the RT-QuIC, but MRI are different ways that we can get a better diagnosis. And so, you know, I think these numbers are fairly accurate, and they are going to continue to increase. You know, you see the upward trend there. We have an aging population in this country, and this is a disease, like I said, of the older population. So I wouldn't be surprised if we keep seeing more and more cases each year. That would be completely expected based on the fact that we have more people that are going to be 65 years of age and older. As I mentioned, this is still a disease confirmed only by neuropathology, regardless of the fact that RT-QuIC is such an outstanding test. Neuropathology can be a sentinel for unique and possibly emerging prion disease cases. And that was shown with the variant CJD outbreak in the 90s, where the neuropathology, the brain tissue analysis, actually showed unique features that distinguished it from regular Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. RT-QuIC is a great test, but we still compare it to autopsy to determine how great it is. And like I said, we rely on that neuropathology data to make our death certificate data as accurate as possible. I mentioned two main mechanisms for our surveillance, of course, the death certificate data from the National Center for Health Statistics and also the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center. In addition, we also work closely with public health departments and medical personnel, and of course also family members, the public and the media. These are all various ways that we can find out about a case. And we include all verified cases as part of our national prion disease surveillance. Some of you may be concerned because you know the death certificate is incorrect for a family member or loved one. And there is a route that can be taken to amend death certificates. This process varies from state to state. Like I said, even if it's not coded as CJD, we may still know about it, or we may know about it through other means, such as the National Prion Center, or from other mechanisms. But like I said, there is a process to have that changed if that's important to you. And like I said before, we don't capture every single case. We make our best effort, but no surveillance system is 100%. The disease is now reportable to some degree in almost all states. Some people feel like making it reportable in their state is essential for us to find out about it. But at the end of the day, a misdiagnosed case is still a misdiagnosed case. So even if it's reportable in your state, if they think it's Alzheimer's, then it's not going to be reported as CJD. So we just try to remind people of that. At the same time, we did work with the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists to outline specific surveillance goals, and often making a disease reportable in a state can help accomplish those goals within the state. So certainly we don't argue against it being reportable, and it can be a mechanism for better reporting. We also provide funding to strategic states for enhanced surveillance activities, and that strategy involves, for example, a state with a high population. It may have been a state where mad cow or BSE had been identified previously, and chronic wasting disease, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Variant CJD, I've mentioned it several times. Again, if this was at the Foundation conference in DC, you would be pretty sick of hearing about variant CJD at this point. But since you're just hearing me tonight, I can go ahead and give a little background. Of course, variant CJD is the human form of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, more commonly known as mad cow disease. Only 232 cases of this disease ever worldwide. And most of those, 178, were in the United Kingdom. So if you've heard from a friend of a friend of a friend that they had mad cow disease or they had variant CJD, in all likelihood, they did not. There was probably a miscommunication or an error somewhere along the way where someone was trying to say they had classic Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease or some other prion disease. Especially in this country, it's rare, only 4 cases. All of those were exposed elsewhere or believed to be so, and 2 cases in Canada as well. So very rare in North America and exposed overseas in all cases. I'll talk a little bit about tissue, blood, and organ donation. I know those are issues important to a lot of you. The guidance for industry from the FDA renders a good group of you ineligible, unfortunately, as far as human cells, tissue, things like cornea, skin, bone, heart valves. You'd be ineligible if you've been diagnosed with any form of CJD, if you have history of CJD in a blood relative, if you spend a certain amount of time in the United Kingdom or in Europe. Those are all things that could get you, make you ineligible for donating tissue. At the same time, FDA does not regulate organ donation, things like liver and kidney. There are no absolute exclusions with organ donation. There used to be an exclusion for HIV. Even that has changed in recent years. And I have a slide there from last year where they began allowing organ transplants from living donors who have HIV. So basically, organs from those with CJD can be donated. The question is whether they'll actually be used. And that's based on an outcome of a risk-benefit analysis by the medical staff. So it comes down to how badly they need that organ as to whether they'll use it or not. And that would just depend, again, on that risk-benefit assessment of the situation at the time. Now, the big news, the big update for 2020, just a couple months ago, in April, the FDA released new recommendations for blood donation, partly spurred on by the need for blood as a result of COVID-19. They were having, a significant drop in donations. This change had been in the work for quite some time, but I think COVID sped it along somewhat. And what they did was tweak some of the existing rules, some of the existing guidance. And again, these are recommendations. Still ineligible would be persons who have a history of transfusion in the UK, France, or Ireland, persons who have spent 3 months or more in the UK from 1980 to 1996, and persons diagnosed with variant CJD or other prion diseases, or with a blood relative with genetic CJD. Now, where the changes come in, they drop the recommendation to defer former or current U.S. military personnel, civilian military personnel, and their dependents who resided at U.S. military bases. And that's huge. I think a big portion of the calls that we get year to year are from people in this situation that are always very disappointed they can't donate. It also drops the recommendation to defer potential donors who spent 5 years or more in Europe, with the exceptions, of course, listed previously. And finally, they don't recommend questioning donors regarding blood relatives with genetic CJD. Donors previously deferred for having a blood relative with CJD can be re-entered if the blood relative was not diagnosed with the genetic form of the disease. Now, the tricky part of all this is that if you've been permanently deferred, apparently you've been entered into a registry, you're on a list, and you don't just automatically come off this list. You can't just show up at a blood donation center and say, hey, look at these recommendations from the FDA, I can donate now. There's going to be a process to remove your name from this permanent deferral list. And we don't exactly know what that process is going to be or how long it's going to take for them to roll it out. So for now, you may have to sit tight. Again, I don't know when these rules are truly going to go into effect. If you haven't already been permanently deferred, my understanding is that you can go ahead and donate now. But if you have been deferred already, again, there's going to be a process to make that change. Final notes, a lot of this blood deferral stuff is based on hypotheticals. Classic CJD has never been shown to be transmissible through the blood. According to an American Red Cross and CDC study, we claim that the risk remains theoretical. No evidence. Same with the United Kingdom National CJD Research and Surveillance Unit just 2 years ago, 3 years ago rather. The balance of evidence indicates that if sporadic CJD is transmitted by blood transfusion, it must be rare if it happens at all. That's different from variant CJD. Again, variant CJD being the human form of BSC or mad cow disease. That has been shown to transmit through the blood in a few cases. A little bit on funeral homes. I know that's something that unfortunately a lot of you have had to deal with. I put these notes out there. They are on our website. According to how we've seen the evidence, embalming bodies of CJD patients who've been autopsied can be safely performed, but we can't force a funeral home to do it. At the end of the day, they make the call. For that reason, we feel like education is very important of funeral directors. Some are going to be more open to that education and making changes compared to others. Like I said, we do have this on our website. I always like to share this quote from our website because I think it sums up things nicely. There are no special internment, entombment, inurnment, or cremation requirements for patients with CJD. Interment of bodies in closed caskets does not present a significant risk of environmental contamination, and cremated remains can be considered sterile, as the infectious agent does not survive incineration range temperatures. So that's a key thing we like to share because that can obviously affect a lot of you. I'd like to talk a little bit about chronic wasting disease, just because it gets a lot of attention, especially last year in the media. It's kind of the big prion disease of the moment, especially in North America. And what this disease is a prion disease of cervids, which would include species like white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose, and reindeer. It's highly transmissible within the cervid population. We found it among free-ranging deer and elk in 24 states. 22 of those have been identified in the last 2 decades, and also 2 Canadian provinces. And just a few years ago, found in Norway, Finland a couple years later, and Sweden just last year. So it's a European problem now as well. This map's from January. I haven't had time to update it, but I can guarantee you there's definitely a handful, at least, more counties to add. But you can see a lot of red on that map, particularly out in the western area. Colorado and Wyoming is where this disease was first found, but also found along the east and far south as well. So certainly has been found in a lot of new areas. Like I said, last 2 decades, a lot of this, these new areas in red have been found. Like I said, this was big in the media last year. Unfortunately, they took to calling it zombie deer disease. Rather unfortunate name, if you ask me, but did draw a lot of attention to it. The good news is that to date, there is no strong epidemiological evidence for this occurrence of CWD in people. However, we have several things that we need to think about when we make that claim. For one is that CWD is being found in more and more areas, like I said. Last 2 decades, it's been found in 22 more states. So that means there's increased opportunities for human exposure. Secondly, we have a history, as I talked about earlier, of BSE or mad cow disease transmitting to humans. Of course, that's another prion disease of animals that did jump to humans and cause disease. And finally, there are some animal studies that do suggest the potential for CWD transmission to humans. And one of those studies actually involved asymptomatic animals with the disease. And it was shown to transmit to macaques, which is a type of monkey that's somewhat genetically close to humans. So much like there's a lot of concern right now about asymptomatic carriers of COVID-19, there's also the concern that a hunter may not know whether a deer has this disease or not and could be exposed to the infectious agent if they do harvest that deer. So this is something that we like to keep in mind when we are thinking about chronic wasting disease and the potential threat. What we do at CDC is we are engaged in several different studies to try to find out more about this disease and that potential for transmission. One of those things we do is we follow up on people who hunted in Wyoming and Colorado, where the disease has been present for years, and we try to find people who die of prion disease in that group. And we want to see if hunters are more likely to have prion disease, because that would be a red flag, obviously. We also follow up with individuals who consumed venison from CWD positive deer in Wisconsin. We have a very unique situation in Wisconsin where if a hunter harvests a deer and they have it tested, the state will follow up with that hunter to give them the results of their CWD test. And when they give them the results, they ask if they've consumed the deer. And if the hunter says they have, then they make a note of that. And that way we're able to follow that person over time and again, see if they're dying of anything unusual, such as a novel form of prion disease. So this is a very valuable study. To date, no matches have been found among potentially exposed people when we cross-check them against not only cause of death data, but also against data from the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center. So good news on that so far. However, prion diseases are characterized by long incubation periods, so we would need to conduct this for a number of years before we can really have any solid answers on this big question. Finally, we also conduct analyses of highly CWD endemic states where the disease is very often found compared to states without the disease to compare differences in the rate of human prion disease mortality. So my final thoughts, these diseases obviously present unique diagnostic and public health challenges. Some of the activities we do at CDC include things like conducting surveillance through various methods to best capture the majority of cases. We investigate cases of interest in collaboration with the affected states, which are obviously valuable partners in all of this. We also provide advice on prion disease related issues. And as part of that, I just like to mention that includes things like infection control related concerns. An example of that, within the first month of this year, I had calls from 3 different medical facilities in 3 different states reporting situations where someone who was symptomatic with possible CJD underwent a surgical procedure. They didn't suspect CJD at the time, and that's why they went forward with the procedure and didn't use proper sterilization techniques. And obviously, these medical facilities were concerned about possible spread of the disease through the instruments they used. So these diseases continue to, these situations continue to happen. We always are very willing to provide advice to the facilities when they do. And hopefully over time, through education and progress there, these situations will be less likely to happen. Finally, we collaborate with medical and public health personnel, the Prion Center, and of course the CJD Foundation, which is essential to our work, and improvement in premortem diagnostic testing. Again, a big example of that being the RT Quick test should benefit our surveillance efforts, but autopsy remains very important to our work. Of course, these are resources you're probably all very familiar with. CJD Foundation, CDC, our information's there, and the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center. And I'd like to thank the group at Prion and Public Health Office that I work with, Larry Schoenberger, Ermias Boulay, Joe Abrams, Teresa Hammett, Marissa Person, Bobby Bryant, and others. And of course, all the wonderful people at the CJD Foundation, National Prion Center, and state and public health departments. And of course, now I'm willing to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay, great, Ryan. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So I will be passing along questions. We're going to focus on surveillance questions tonight. If you have questions about the basics of prion disease, feel free to visit our website for some great presentations there that address that. So getting to the questions here. Ryan, are there any recent CJD cases with a confirmed history of consuming meat from CWD cervids?
No. It's difficult in several regards. Like I mentioned, we have the long incubation period we have to contend with. So, someone may have eaten the deer years ago that will end up causing the prion disease later on down the road. And so to know whether that's a positive or a negative, wouldn't be easy to do. However, the best way we have of looking at this is the Wisconsin study I mentioned, where we have that database, not a huge number of hunters, but at the same time, we know that they were exposed. We know that they had a deer test positive for chronic wasting disease. They ate some of that deer. None of that group has had a prion disease to date, and we continue to follow them every year.
Okay, great. Have there been any changes in the incidence rate in recent years, and are they due to better detection of the disease, or could they be associated with other risk factors?
Yeah, that's a good question. And what I tried to show in that figure was that the incidence has been relatively stable over the time period. Now, the case numbers continue to go up, and I think you can attribute that largely to better detection, more awareness by providers and public health agencies, and also the aging population. But the incidence has been relatively stable. Now, you look back in the late 90s, probably early 2000s, there were probably some CDC reports that said we're right around 1.0 per million, 0.9 per million, something like that. And now we're at 1.2. So if you consider that to be an increase, you could say it's gone up a little bit over the time period. But like I said, I think that's a result of better surveillance, not more exposure to something else that's out there. And the important note that I would make there is with a disease like variant CJD, there are distinguishing factors that make that disease recognizable compared to classic CJD. And our hope is that if there is something else out there causing prion disease, we will be able to recognize it as a novel form and not have it lost in the crowd of sporadic CJD cases.
Okay. Is there thought about, and maybe you touched on this, the aging of the population and how that might be impacting numbers as well?
Yes, exactly. The population is aging. This is the disease of older people. The median age of death is right around 66, 67, 68 years of age. And as you're all probably very aware, most cases die within a year. So there's going to be a large number of cases in their 60s. And the baby boomer generation is right in that group. Large population that would be considered at risk based on that. So certainly more cases. And so that is a concern for us, not only because of the people affected, but also the potential for further infection control concerns. This means more cases in the hospital, potentially getting surgical procedures for other things. And so we obviously have to keep that in mind.
Okay, and speaking of surgical procedures, the next question is, can blood transfusions be a method of transmission?
As far as we know, no. With classic CJD, we've never had a known documentation of that disease spread through blood transfusion. And we've looked at this through a couple of ways. We have an ongoing look-back study where if someone has CJD with a history of blood donation, we make an effort to work with the Red Cross to follow recipients of the blood that was donated. And none of those recipients has come down with a prion disease, which obviously is a nice piece of evidence to suggest that there is not transfusion-related transmission of the disease. We also don't see large numbers of prion disease in the hemophilia population. You know, this is a group that would receive numerous blood transfusions in their lifetime and therefore be considered more at risk of that kind of thing. Now, there have been a couple of hemophilia cases identified with prion disease. The statistical analyses that have been performed have suggested that that's more likely due to chance. Of course, sporadic CJD doesn't care whether you have hemophilia or not. And so certainly we'd expect a case from time to time in that population as well. So no evidence really of classic CJD transmitting through the blood. And as I mentioned in one of my slides, variant CJD, on the other hand, there have been a handful of cases that we do believe was transmitted through the blood from a donor with variant CJD. Again, we get back to asymptomatic being an important issue. The donors at the time did not have any symptoms of variant CJD, donated the blood, died of variant CJD later, and then the recipient of that blood came down with variant CJD later as well.
Okay. The next question, Ryan, is, would you consider receiving a whole body donation from someone who passed from E200K mutation of CJD?
Yeah, as far as donations go, we would typically defer any question like that to Brian Appleby and others at the National Prion Disease Pathology Surveillance Center. You know, usually the autopsies focus primarily on the brain, since that's where the bulk of their analyses can really decipher and determine the level of prion engagement. Now, with chronic wasting disease, there is an enhanced protocol if someone's believed to have been exposed to CWD, where they request additional samples, for example, the spleen. But as far as full body for a genetic form, I'd have to defer to the Prion Center for that.
Okay. We have Brian on the line. Dr. Appleby, did you want to comment on that at all?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so generally, exactly like what Ryan said, we generally collect brain on cases of prion disease. There are some instances where we will collect other tissues. Generally, those are people that are at risk of possibly being exposed the chronic wasting disease, so those who hunted or consumed venison in those states that Ryan showed, sometimes will collect spleen, lymph nodes, and appendices from those cases. Otherwise, generally, it's just brain.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
So Ryan, the next question is, if the death certificate says natural causes presumed CJD, would that have been counted?
Yes, because CJD is on there, our search algorithm would pick up a case like that.
Okay, next, if a patient comes back with a positive RT-QuIC result, does that confirm that it's sporadic CJD? This is a question we hear a lot.
And again, this may be something that Brian can speak a little bit better to. I know that there are certain forms of prion disease that are more likely to have an accurate RT-QuIC compared to others. So it certainly does have some differences depending on the type of prion disease in terms of how accurate it is. But Brian, I don't know if you wish to elaborate further or not on that.
Yeah, I think the question may be stemming from, if you look at diagnostic criteria that's published, it refers to probable sporadic CJD, and that a positive RT-QuIC can be indicative of that. However, these are really kind of surveillance and research criteria. Really, a positive RT-QuIC only tells you that it's prion disease. It doesn't tell you what type. So we actually used to have, positive RT-QuIC signifies sporadic CJD in our report that we'd send out physicians. We've since changed that several months ago to just say prion disease. As Ryan said, there are some forms of CJD that are RT-QuIC positive and some that are negative. Only about 10% of sporadic cases are negative by RT-QuIC. The rest are positive.
Okay, thank you. So the next question was, is there an increase in CJD in areas with endemic CWD, chronic wasting disease, in the surveyed populations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we continue to look at that across the country, comparing states with and without the disease, and also states with it to one degree versus states with a different degree. What I can tell you is in a state like Colorado, where CWD was first identified in the 60s, it's been there for decades, we don't see a really high rate of human prion disease. So certainly that's a good sign. We have some ongoing analyses that are trying to look at that question in greater detail. And so, we're still working through the data, but the preliminary findings, like I said, just looking at a state with decades-long endemic chronic wasting disease, we don't see concerning levels of human prion disease that would suggest that there might be an issue in that state.
Okay. Next question is, have you developed a survey to send to families that might help you find connections or a cluster? Something similar to what the DoD created related to ALS. We get a lot of questions from families about clusters.
Right. And clusters are interesting. A lot of clusters really do look like clusters on the surface when you first find out about one. We'll have 3 cases in the same small town, and it'll be very concerning, very alarming, and the people that inform us, obviously feel very strongly that, there must be some common exposure or reason for this happening. And when we've looked into these situations, what we typically find is that a number of things could account for this so-called cluster. For example, there may be a misdiagnosis. So you start with 3 cases. It turns out one of them wasn't prion disease at all. It could be that one person just recently moved into that small town, and you can't say, oh, they were all exposed at the same time. It could be the fact that one of those 3 people had a genetic form of the disease, and so certainly that would remove them somewhat from the equation about whether there was a common exposure causing this cluster. And so, typically that's kind of the investigation and the findings we get from the clusters that are reported. We don't have any, I guess you would say, proactive cluster investigation. Usually it's when someone brings something to our attention, a family member, a community, local public health department, to report a situation. And like I said, we'll look into that with the resources available to see if there's something we can find that could somewhat lessen our concern about the situation. We do work with the states to make questionnaires for case investigations that have a number of questions regarding various exposures that could have been encountered in the patient's lifetime. So there is a questionnaire of sorts, but it's not something that I'd say we have specifically for that.
Okay, great. Next question is, what do you consider a long incubation period to be?
Yes, and I'm sorry I didn't clarify that more. You take a disease like COVID-19 and, you are exposed to the guy coughing on you. You're going to probably come down with symptoms the next 14 days. It's not going to be months or years before you come down with the disease. With prion diseases, it's going to be a year, years, decades. And there's a range, of course. The shortest incubation period I'm aware of from exposure to onset is still over a year, as far as I know. I'm not aware of anything shorter than a year, but the long end of that is over 40 years. We have cases that were administered human growth hormone that was contaminated. It was derived from cadavers, and some of those cadavers had died of CJD. They had received that product in the mid to late 70s, prior to 1978, and died of it just last year, the year before. So it can be 40 years, it can be longer than that. So 1 to 40 years and beyond. With variant CJD, obviously, which was a concern for a lot of people, our best rule of thumb there is, 10 years, 12 years from the time of exposure to contaminated beef to the onset of that illness. And again, that's just a ballpark. It could be much longer. So it really just depends.
Okay, we had two similar questions. How has the pandemic impacted the CDC's work on CJD? And a second question, have autopsies to confirm CJD been placed on the back burner due to the COVID research?
All right. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'll let Brian address the second part of that because he's more aware of the day-to-day activities of the Prion Center as far as those autopsies go. What I can tell you about the work at the CDC is you can choose to volunteer to work on the COVID-19 response. And I personally chose to be involved in that response for the month of April. And so during that month, some of my Prion activities were put on the back burner to a certain degree, although I tried to keep one foot in the Prion world at the same time. So when that happens, there is, I guess, a little bit of back burner going on. However, January, February, March, May, and June, I have been working on Prion activities. Now, that being said, right now where I'm engaged in the Prion world, a couple other people in our office are deployed to work with the COVID-19 response. So we try not to have the whole office off being deployed on the disease at any one time, but there's certainly a demand at CDC for people to contribute to the response because this is such an urgent public health need at this time. I wouldn't say that our surveillance is suffering in any way. I say the biggest impact that we've had from a Prion standpoint as far as surveillance has not been directly at CDC, but with some of our partners at the various state and local health departments. They've been hit much harder than we have even because so much of the ongoing response is on the local level. The testing, the contact tracing, all levels of the response has really fallen largely on their shoulders. So people that normally would have been our prion contact in the various state have pretty much had to put that aside to assist the state with the coronavirus response. And so if I reached out to state A right now and said, can you give me, your most recent line list of cases because I wanted to check something, they'd probably say something to the effect of, call me in 2 months and I'll get that to you. And then, of course, that's not across the board. And there's some that are juggling and finding a way to do everything at the same time. But it's a stretch. It's very difficult for them. But we're making do the best we can. The death certificates continue. The work at the Prion Center continues. And again, Brian can address that better. And we continue to conduct various studies that we're working on. A couple days ago, I submitted an abstract based on the infection control issues that I mentioned earlier in my talk. So the work continues, and it continues to be a priority of our office as well.
Brian, did you want to chime in on the autopsy part of that?
Yeah, I would say actually COVID-19 affected the Prion Center in two major ways. Unfortunately, one of the ways was for almost 2 months, our spinal fluid samples dropped to a quarter of what they had been prior to the pandemic, which is really concerning because that means that people aren't getting tested. And just as a clinician, it was hard to get any test done with this going on, whether it be a lumbar puncture or an MRI. So that was certainly concerning. Autopsies are pretty much forbidden at this point during COVID, especially brain autopsies, because there's concern that the bone saw could aerosolize the virus. So you have to take pretty strict precautions. So we're still able to do autopsies, and I think we've only had to decline a few where we couldn't find a provider that would remove the brain for us, but it has resulted in autopsies being extremely expensive because we're having to use private providers to do the services for us, whereas before a lot of local academic medical centers would be able to do it. Some of these academic medical centers are opening up, so hopefully that will help. But I would say that the biggest has been the cost of the autopsies.
Okay, thank you both. So the next question is, in terms of surveillance, do you track how many cases were found via MRI versus RT-QuIC when you reconcile the death certificates?
So, in other words, when we look at the death certificates versus the Prion Center data, are we determining? Well,
Are you tracking the method of diagnosis, whether it was found through MRI or RT-QuIC or both?
Not in a scientific way. For a long time, we collected medical records for cases less than 55 years of age. And the main goal there was to see if there's anything that might be concerning for variant CJD, which strikes a younger age group. So at that time, we did make a note of the various tests that were done in a very systematic way. We still collect medical records for extremely young cases, especially those less than 30, because they are such a unique subset. And usually there is an external source of exposure to be looked at. But in terms of saying this person got their diagnosis on MRI or RT-QuIC, we don't have that broken down. What I will say is there's pretty good agreement between a lot of the tests. MRI is a very good diagnostic tool in the hands of someone that knows how to read it. And RT-QuIC, of course, as well. And so, someone may be diagnosed with prion disease in a number of different ways that all line up. They may have that positive RT-QuIC and a positive MRI, and then later on down the road, a positive brain tissue sample. So a lot of times it's more than one thing that contributes to the diagnosis.
Okay, now a question about dental work and eye procedures, which is another one we get a lot from families. So the patient had dental work and eye procedures prior to symptoms and diagnosis. The family notified all the doctors, but was there any other action that should be taken?
our basic stance on this, and there will be some discussion, there's not a unanimous consensus on this, is that asymptomatic does not carry the level of concern that a symptomatic patient would. And so, if I knew, I don't have any, I guess, evidence of transmission from an asymptomatic. Collecting that evidence wouldn't necessarily be easy. But certainly we would treat an asymptomatic patient undergoing a surgical procedure a lot differently than we would someone that has symptoms that could indicate prion disease. And our advice generally to surgeons and in the medical field is that if there's any suspicion or any possibility of prion disease in a patient, they need to treat it as if it is prion disease. And they could do that by not doing the procedure. They could do that by destroying the instruments or using more stringent sterilization or quarantining the instruments until they had the final diagnosis that tells them one way or the other. So those symptomatic patients, definitely we have that level of concern about. But someone that's asymptomatic, there isn't that level of concern that we usually say.
And Ryan, you drew a line between symptomatic and asymptomatic. What about for genetic patients who know that they carry the genetic mutation?
Right. And there again, there's not consensus on this. I would put that in the same boat. Someone that has the mutation but is asymptomatic, based on our understanding of the disease, we would not say that the provider needs to do anything other than routine sterilization and disinfection. But there are providers that'll say, there's no way I'm doing that procedure, or they'll say, I'll do that procedure, but you need to buy me a new $100,000 piece of equipment that I'm going to use to do it. So just because we feel a certain way doesn't mean that others will act on that. And granted, I don't have evidence necessarily to provide to suggest that it's 100% safe either.
Okay, well, we're a little bit over time, but there are a few more questions related to surveillance that I'd like to run by you. So thanks for bearing with us. Is there any evidence that cataract surgery can transmit CJD?
We are not aware of any evidence that it can. Because of the nature of the cataract procedure, there's not that level of concern of transmission just based on what we know about how that procedure is performed.
Okay. Are there known risk factors for sporadic CJD?
It depends on what you consider to be a risk factor. A risk factor could be your age. It's more likely to come down with sporadic CJD if you're over 55. Other than that, there have been case control studies that have been done, but the findings have been kind of a mixed bag. And I wouldn't come out and say there's a definitive risk factor out there for the disease, at least that I'm aware of.
Okay. If reportability does not help states with surveillance numbers and the cause is misdiagnosis, is there anything we can do as families to help change this in our states?
Well, on a personal level, if you're aware that a misdiagnosis has happened and you feel confident that it was prion disease, you can take the steps that are there for your particular state to have the death certificate amended. There's always the route you can take to contact your local representative, let them know your concerns, and your local health department. Let them, education is a valuable tool. And that's one reason why we're so thrilled to work with the CJD Foundation is because education is an important part of their work, obviously. And I know they do a lot of work to perform grand rounds around the country to get the word out about the disease. And that's a way that medical providers, health departments, funeral homes, all sorts of different groups can be aware of these diseases, what they should be concerned about and what they shouldn't be concerned about.
Okay, great. You've touched on some parts of this. Is there any correlation with location to an increase in risk of sporadic CJD?
It's hard to parse that out. When you look at it on a worldwide basis, certain countries report higher rates of prion disease compared to others, but then you have to consider how different countries perform their surveillance. There was a lot of concern, I remember, with Switzerland reporting a rate of, I think, 2 per million for sporadic CJD. And, that may or may not be what their situation is, and it may be based on the population that lives there. And it's a relatively small country, and there may be some fluctuation there as a result of that. You also get into that when you look at state by state. A state with a large population is not going to have the fluctuation in rates that a smaller state might have. I think that at any given time, you're going to have different rates across the country. And in the next year, you may see something different. That's the nature of surveillance. And when you're dealing with a rare disease, just a few numbers more at any given time can bump those rates up or down when you break it into small parts. There's also a bias if you're looking at urban versus rural, if you're looking at where someone might be treated versus where they lived. You might see more cases in a large urban center with a large hospital if people are going from around the state or from a whole region to be treated at that hospital. And that's how they're doing the surveillance. If you're doing it by residents, certain areas may have better surveillance than others. So there are differences here and there, but not to a huge degree where we're seeing, 10 per million in some areas and no cases at all somewhere else, at least not on a long-term basis. And you really have to look at these things over a number of years and not just a snapshot here and a snapshot there to get a better picture of it.
Okay, if CWD were to break the species barrier and become a human disease, what might the clinical presentation look like? And do you think it would be likely to maintain asymptomatic disease status?
That is a great question. I don't think it would be asymptomatic in humans if there was a true transmission. Now, how would we recognize the disease if it happened? Well, there's a couple ways. That's one reason why we strongly encourage autopsy, is because analysis of the brain tissue will hopefully be our window into seeing any differences in the disease. Now, as far as a clinical presentation, we don't know what it'll look like. And that's why getting an accurate history is important. If astute medical provider in the state has someone with unique symptoms and they say, I'm a hunter, ask another question, say, really, where did you hunt? And then hopefully at that point, local health department, state health department, or CDC can be involved to ask the right questions, try to nail down whether an exposure is plausible or possible or likely, and then take a closer look at how that disease progresses. Obviously, that's not easy to do, and it's one reason why these smaller, more localized studies are so important. Looking at hunters who hunted in Colorado and Wyoming and following up their causes of death, looking at hunters in Wisconsin that knowingly consumed CWD positive animals and watching what they're being diagnosed with. I think these are the true ways to determine if this disease looks like something. Is it mirroring sporadic CJD? Is it looking like something completely different? I think that's going to be our best bet.
Okay, just two more questions. If your question was not answered, please either write to us on our helpline or visit our website. Under the 2017 conference section, there are some great presentations about that, the basics of prion disease that will answer those questions. So next, Ryan, if a blood relative has sporadic CJD, are any blood relatives at increased risk of sporadic CJD?
Not that we know of. As long as it was sporadic CJD, I don't think there's any documented evidence of there being any higher risk of sporadic CJD among any other family member.
Well, Ryan, I think we've gone about 10 minutes over time. We thank you very much for that. For everyone on the line, watch for updates on our other virtual conference sessions. We have some exciting stuff coming up. In August, we'll have our keynote speaker. Excuse me, our keynote speaker, Simon Mead. We'll have updates from our grant recipients in September and October of this year. So watch your email, watch our site, and thank you for being here tonight.